Hey, I want to say hello to everybody at the Launch Conference and a special shout out to my good friend Anthony Delaney. Anthony, thank you so much for your leadership in this area and what you're doing for church planting and multiplication and mobilizing people all over that part of the world. And also a shout out to all my friends that are part of New Thing, including Emma Jeffries and the rest of the gang there. And it's great to be with you because it's great to be with leaders who are passionate about how do we mobilize and multiply the church to advance the Jesus mission. And especially right now, because by all accounts, spiritual interest right now in the Western world is probably higher than it's ever been in our lifetime. I just heard some stuff that came from Google, and Google's telling us they're seeing a spike in searches right now, just during this pandemic, in God, searches in prayer, searches even for church or church online. In addition to that, I heard Bobby Gernwald talk about this, the YouVersion, the Bible app. They're also seeing a dramatic increase in traffic for Bible usage and looking for Bible reading plans. And it's this kind of a moment for leaders just like you and leaders just like me who are passionate about the Jesus mission. We have to mobilize our people to reach them. All right, so how? How do we do that? Well, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 12, and you know this verse, but I'm going to repeat it again. It just reminds us that Christ gave us what? The apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, the teachers. Why? To equip. To equip. But again, the question comes, okay, well, how? Because I think every one of us are going like, yeah, I want to equip. I want to equip the people in my church. I want to mobilize them for the mission. But how do I actually do it? And I know over the years, I've tried lots of ways that didn't work. I remember when I was in college, I launched something called the Soul Winners Club, where I had people out doing street evangelism. And I mean, total failure. I remember when I did student ministry as a young youth pastor. I actually had my junior high and high school kids going door to door. Bad experience. Even as a church leader, I remember using the 2 diagnostic questions to kind of try to trick people into giving you the wrong answer. And I trained people to do that, and that was a fail. But all those failures led me on this search to look for something that every day we could share the love of God with people, where we live, where we work, and we play. And I remember it came in a form of an email. I got this email, and it was just simply titled, Converters versus Blessers. And somebody was sharing with me this doctoral thesis, Converters versus Blessers. And basically, the doctoral thesis did some research on 2 teams of missionaries. 2 teams of missionaries that both went to Thailand. One team was simply called the Converters. And they were going to convert people. They were going to to win souls, as they would say. The Converters. That was the first team. The second team was the Blessers. And the Blessers went with just kind of a Genesis 12 kind of vision of, oh, God's blessed us, and now we're going to bless other people, just to be blessers. They followed both these teams for 2 years. After 2 years of following them, what they discovered in 2 different categories was this. The first category was social capital. What they found in regards to social capital, and that's about making the community a better place to live, the Converters, almost no net gain, almost no difference. But when it came to the Blessers, they could actually measure the amount of social capital that they'd introduced into that community, that they made this place a better place to live, to thrive. That was the first thing. But the second thing was even more fascinating because they then began to observe and ask the question, well, how many people were actually converted? The Converters, over 2 years, converted 2 people. The Blessers, over 2 years, converted 100 people. 50 to 1. Part of what came out of that drove me right back to Genesis chapter 12, these blessers. Because in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, it says, God is challenging Abraham, saying, Abraham, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make your name great, and you're going to be a blessing. And what then you're going to do is you're going to bless others. You're going to bless all the people of the earth. And I began to think, maybe God's original mobilization strategy for reaching people was this blessing strategy. I mean, that's what we saw in this doctoral thesis, a blessing strategy that actually seemed to work. Well, After that, then I began to read through the Gospels once again in the life and ministry of Jesus. And I began to see that, in many ways what Jesus did wasn't so much a converter kind of approach to people, but was more of a blesser kind of approach. And the more I began to look at the ways that he blessed people, you could almost categorize them. And not only could you categorize them, but in time, what we were able to do is we were able to put them into kind of simple, memorable practices for mobilizing people. And we call them the B.L.E.S.S practices. And the B.L.E.S.S practices are actually 5 practices. One begins with B, another L, another E, another S, and another S. And before you dismiss this going like, well, that's kind of cheesy, I'll tell you what, you go back and you read the Gospels and you see if Jesus didn't do exactly that. For example, the first of these 5 B.L.E.S.S practices we see in the life of Jesus was begin with prayer. B, begin with prayer. A little bit of a stretch, but B, begin with prayer. Think about this. How did Jesus actually begin his earthly ministry? In Luke chapter 6, it says he went out on a mountain and he prayed. That's how he began. That's how we should begin. Prayer is both how you do the mission and also how you discover your mission. It's both those things, how you do the mission and how you discover the mission. If there's a person that you're thinking about that you want to reach, you want to introduce them to the good news of the gospel, you begin with prayer. If you're a church planner and you're going into a new neighborhood or a new community or a brand new city and you want to see that place transformed, what you do is you begin with prayer. Because prayer is both how you do the mission and prayer is also how you discover your mission. The second practice, L, stands for listen. And again, we see this in the life of Jesus. In Luke chapter 19, think about this. When Jesus heals the blind man, okay, before you get to the healing part, before he does anything, what does he do first? He listens. That's what he does. He actually asks the blind man, do you want to be healed? And then he gives him the ability just to respond to that question. He gives him that dignity by listening. And what I'm afraid of is as Christians, we're more known for our talking than we are our listening. It was actually the inventor of the stethoscope who taught doctors. He said this, he said, doctors, you listen to your patients and they will tell you how to heal them. The third of the 5 practices is E, stands for eat. You know this is true. One of the great grievances that the religious establishment had with Jesus was that he was always eating and drinking with sinners. That was just part of how he lived. That was part of how he went about accomplishing the mission. What I discover as I talk to people in the church that I lead is almost universally, everybody wants to be engaged in the mission. They want to be a part of the mission. They want to see their neighbors, the people where they live, work, and play, come to know the love of God and follow Jesus. But the hard part is when we try to involve them and mobilize them in that, we usually ask them to be involved in another program. It's another night out. It's another event. It's more hours away. But what I discover here in these practices is it's not actually an addition to your life, but it's how you live your life. You see, it's not an addition to your life, but how you live your life. For example, with eat. How many times do you eat every week? Okay, most of us probably 3 times a day, 7 days a week, 21 different times. What you have here is you have 21 different opportunities to actually include other people in your life and be involved in the mission. The fourth practice was serve. And again, you see this in the life of Jesus. It was bold. I mean, in Matthew 20:28, he clarifies his strategic approach to the mission. And he says, I didn't come to be served, but instead I came to serve. Not to be served, but to serve. And because of his model, the early church, they got this. And that is why they catalyzed this missional movement. Then the last of the 5 practices, another S, stands for story. And we see again Jesus doing this. He shares who he was. In John 14:6, for example, he says, I am the way, I'm the truth, and the life. Now, I want to be clear, there's nothing the matter with proclamation. Proclamation is important. Proclamation is essential. But I think what we're going to learn here in these blessed practices is that proclamation doesn't have to be first. Well, after reading it in Genesis 12, after seeing it in this doctoral thesis, After then discovering it in the Gospels, these practices in the life of Jesus, I became so convicted. I go, okay, you know what? I want to start doing this. I want to try it myself. And I want to just tell you about a friend of mine named Michael. This is my journal. I brought it along with me because almost every day, and here's my entry for today. In the bottom down here, I write the word bless. And I'll usually write about, typically around 8 names. 8 names of people that I'm praying for. People where I live, where I work, where I play. One of the names for several years was one of my friends, Michael. Now, Michael's the kind of guy, if you knew Michael, who he would not typically walk into church on his own. And the reason he would not typically walk into his church on his own is because he saw no reason to. It would never really occur to him that church would actually have something to offer him. Like if his marriage was struggling, it would never occur to him that maybe the church would have something to offer. Or if he was having a hard time parenting, or if he was, addicted to something, or if he was trying to find purpose, it just wouldn't occur to him that the church would have anything to offer. Michael's story, he grew up in an abusive home. By the time he was 15, he moved out on his own. He managed to finish high school, made his way to college, was a very successful athlete as far as track and field, married a beautiful wife, and in time started a company of his own, grew quite large, a large healthcare company where he was the president, and became independently wealthy. But I began, see me using these practices, with prayer. I began to pray for him. Now, both of our sons ran on the same cross-country and track teams at the same high school, one of the best teams in the state, and our boys became very good friends. My son Caleb actually invited his son Austin to our student community, and Michael, the dad, began to see the impact that was having on his son. And because of our love both for the sport and our love for our 2 boys, that kind of drew us together. And so at meets, we would talk. We'd have conversations. And sometimes we'd even travel places together for these meets and hang out. And so there was a lot of listening. Well, when the conversation eventually, and it was him that took it there, turned towards spiritual things, he asked me to go to breakfast with him. He said, hey, would you like to go to breakfast sometime? I said, sure. And so that began a new routine of us going out for breakfast, or sometimes he'd want to introduce me to a brand new restaurant that he wanted to try. But as I got to know Michael, I'll never forget when he said this to me. He said, Dave, and this was actually over breakfast, for 20 years I felt the burden of having not just to live one life, but I felt like I had to live 2 lives. And then he began to explain. The reason he felt like he had to live 2 lives was when Michael was in grad school out in California, him and his best friend Jay went for a drive. Michael was to be the best man in Jay's wedding, and Jay was going to be the best man in Michael's upcoming wedding. Michael said Jay was this guy who was just a very spiritual guy, a very moral person. Michael described this, he's the kind of person that I wanted to be. They went for a drive, and they were in a car accident. Michael was driving. Michael survived. Michael's best friend, Jay, did not, and he watched Jay die in that car. Michael had been negligent in his driving and actually went to jail for a time. Jay's parents held Michael accountable for their son's death and wanted nothing to do with him. And so from that moment forward, as Michael expressed to me, he felt the guilt and the shame of that incident. When he got out of jail, he moved away from Southern California, and he never spoke of the story to anybody else ever again. And so for now 2 decades, for 20 years, he lived with this burden of saying, I feel like I have to not only live my life, but I really need to live for 2 lives. One for him and one for my friend Jay. Well, Michael's used to being the boss, right? He's the CEO of his own company. And I remember one breakfast we were sitting together. He said, okay, Dave, here's the deal. I want you to be my spiritual coach. I've had other coaches. I've had an executive coach, but I want you to be my spiritual coach. I said, sure, I'd be glad to be your spiritual coach. And so we would meet, and we would talk about running, we talk about life, and we talk about spiritual things. So I was praying for him. I was listening to him. We were eating together. And now he'd asked me to be a spiritual coach, so I'm serving him in the way that he asked me to. Then came a day in February where he said, today was 20 years ago. Today was 20 years ago when I killed my friend. And that wasn't just any breakfast. That was kind of the culmination of not just me, but others praying and listening and eating and serving. And then I got a chance to tell the story of how Jesus changed my life and how I believe Jesus wanted to change his life by offering him forgiveness. And not only that, but also redeeming that tragic story and using it for good. And I got to see him say yes to Jesus on that day. And I'll tell you what, it has been just a huge privilege for me to be a part of God's work in Michael's life. My favorite text that I got for him, I got a text message from him, and forgive the language, but I'm just kind of keeping it real. It was a few days after that because he's starting to tell other people about it, and he said, you know what? I used to hear people talk about being born again. They'd talk about being born again, and I'd say bullshit. But now I believe it. I want you to hear Michael's story in his own words, and here it is.
I really did not have a relationship with God, and I did not think about it. It wasn't a goal or objective of mine. And my mentality was, if you want to get something done, you can only really rely on you. And so that's the way I approached the world for many, many years. My name is Michael Kinney. I'm married to Stacy, and I have 4 children, Austin, Zachary, Aiden, and Zane, and I've been coming to community for 2 years. Jay was my roommate in graduate school. So February of 1997, Jay and I went to go see a concert. And on the way home from that concert, back to our apartment, we were in a car wreck. Jay died in the car wreck, extremely emotionally devastated by the loss of my friend. And I felt very responsible, and I was very, very angry with God. So I decided then that I'm going to live 2 lives, one for me and one for Jay. And I began trying to do that through my activities. Everything that I would achieve, it never was enough. It never made me feel differently. I still felt very angry, very alone. It didn't matter how hard I tried or what I accomplished. Something was still missing. I just kept walking around carrying these bags of bricks, never even considering putting them down and maybe asking for help. And my oldest son, Austin, he began going to church with his good friend Caleb. I remember he got baptized, and it really took me aback that he had, on his own, figured out something that I could never figure out. And so I began going to church with a more open mind, trying to pay attention to the signs and to the messages that people were sharing with me. I also have a son who has severe autism, and he has, no ego. And so I have this wonderful reflection of what Jesus Christ looks like without ego with my son Aiden. So the combination of watching Austin and watching and reflecting on my relationship with Aiden really turned my views from egoicism and hubris to humility. And then I was invited to go to a small group, and I knew sort of what that was, but I didn't really know what it was. I'd never been in a small group, and I was very nervous. Very nervous to attend my first session. Particularly the subject was on regret. I remember thinking, wow, how apropos that my first small group is on the subject that I need to learn the most about. And it really opened my eyes. The kind of the tipping point for me was on the 20th anniversary of this car accident, which killed my friend. It's a dark day for me, a very upsetting day, and my family doesn't have any idea, except for my wife. Why am I so upset? Not just all of the time, why am I sort of angry all of the time, but why am I particularly upset this day? What I found was that after I started sharing this story, particularly with my family, and then in some cases with my close friends, that every single time I talked about what happened, it was like I was taking a brick out of the bag and putting it on the ground, and my load was just getting lighter and lighter and lighter. And every single time I did it, I felt better. For most of my life, I thought that asking for help was a sign of weakness. And what I've come to realize is that asking for help is really a sign of strength. And that if you really want some help and you really want to go to the right place, the best place to go is asking God for help and accepting Jesus into your life.
I love that story. And part of the reason I love that story is because after that, I got to baptize Michael. And hear me on this. I didn't get to baptize Michael because I was the pastor of church, and I enjoy that. But I got to baptize Michael because he was my friend. My friend. Someone I got to pray for, I got to listen to, I got to eat with, I got to serve, and then I got to share the good news in the form of a story. I'll tell you, and this has so changed my life and really changed a lot that's happened in the life of our church that we've written a book called B.L.E.S.S. 5 everyday practices that have how to love your neighbor and change the world. And here's why I think it's so important, why I wanted to share this with you, because I think we live right now in a time of unprecedented opportunity. People are searching. The majority of people in the West, okay, even though it's a secular society, still believe in God. In both sides of the ocean. They still believe in God. Not necessarily the one true God, but they still believe in some form of God. And one-third of them say that they're interested in having a spiritual conversation with a close friend. It's up to us as leaders to mobilize those people. To mobilize those people, not necessarily as converters, but I believe to mobilize them to go out and bless the world.